Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. More than 4 months to tonight have passed with Indian occupied and annexed Kashmir reeling under a security lockdown. The economy has lost an estimated $1.5 billion. The internet services remain suspended. Normal life is nearly crippled. Facts are hard to come by, and it is difficult to assess the mood and levels of violence. Late last month, there was a grenade attack, a clear indication that despite the place being the most militarized region in the world, resistance is alive. WhatsApp accounts are automatically suspended as per Facebook inactivity policy. If users don't log into their account for 120 days, that's 4 months, they are deactivated, meaning individuals will have to sign up to the service again. Since there is no internet, Kashmiris can't use the service. India knows this, which is why it is not restoring internet services. Delhi is aware that resistance can be coordinated through social media messaging. The mindset comes through in the video that went viral and showed the Indian Consul General in New York talking about the Israeli settlement model. He said, and I quote, "I don't know why we don't follow it. It has happened in the Middle East. If the Israeli people can do it, we can also do it," Sandeep Chakraborty said, adding that the current Indian leadership is, quote unquote, determined to do so. To discuss the ongoing state repression in occupied Kashmir, we are joined by Asad Baig, the journalist and digital rights activist, also the founder of Media Matters for Democracy, joins us from Islamabad. Thank you, Asad Baig. I also have with me Hassan Akbar, who is the Director of Programs at Jinnah Institute. Thank you to Hassan also. Let me begin with Asad Baig. Asad, since you work in this area, give us a sense of why it's important to discuss the fact that the Kashmiris don't have WhatsApp or internet services for that matter.
Thank you. I think it's slightly bigger than that. I think what we see right now is just a projection of what has been happening since 4 months. And now it's a stark reality right in front of us. But this has been happening for 4 months now. So WhatsApp accounts are suspended because of the non-usage online. Facebook has apparently a privacy policy for that. But my concern is slightly bigger than this. My concern is that why isn't anybody from Facebook or Twitter or any other big foundation for that matter coming out and saying this stuff about the internet blockade in Kashmir? Because internet is just not one medium. It's life now. Your ATMs operate on internet. Everything you use, like 10 digital services in Pakistan, for instance, living in metropolitan area, you use 10 different digital services. All of them are not working now. So it's not just a concern of internet's disconnection. It's a grave violation of human rights.
So Asad, you're basically saying that if you suspend internet services, normal life, normal activity, business and economic activity, health services, banking and the rest of it, everything will grind to a halt.
Absolutely. I mean, on one hand, the Indian administration talks about digital India and how the India is kind of making its transition towards digital sort of space, and every little service from ordering food to ordering medication online is now online, is in your mobile phone or the apps. And on the other side, they are blatantly denying the right to communicate to a whole lot of Kashmiris. And this, frankly, to me, is absurd and on some level hypocritical as well. But more importantly, my concern is with Facebook and Twitter. They talk about all of these policies when their medium is concerned. They are not saying anything. They're suspiciously quiet. And I cannot sort of, the only thing I can do is assume that they might be quiet because of all the business that they might be getting from India.
So I absolutely take your point. One of the reasons these giants have also been criticized by rights groups is precisely this. Now, according to one estimate that I was reading up on, it's about 1% of the usage, the Facebook, WhatsApp usage in India is in the occupied and now annexed Kashmir. The rest of it is in mainland India. So it seems to me that if these guys were to say something in relation to what's going on in Kashmir, as you mentioned, they'll probably lose business in mainland India. But considering that as a possibility, assuming that India would say, okay, you guys are talking to us like this, we are going to tell you to take a hike. What services would India use? I mean, if not Facebook and the rest of it, I mean, are there any alternatives there for India?
Look, Facebook definitely is a leader, and so is Twitter in what they do. So there is, I think, no point in that conversation, frankly speaking, because I don't see any other competitors who are kind of leading or even far or even close to Facebook or Twitter. But then there is one other point, Ejaz, I would like to mention here. What we are asking from Facebook is to make sure that Facebook applies the laws of Pakistan on Facebook. And we keep doing that by asking them to take off content and so on. So it's fine. But then Facebook has kind of an excuse to apply the same laws from India on Facebook, right? Essentially, we should have been asking from Facebook not to apply any country's laws, because internet is a universal medium, and Facebook should strengthen their own community mechanism where they kind of discourage religious hatred and that sort of thing. So we're kind of playing into that trap as well, specifically on the side of people who are talking to Facebook and so on. So this is, I think, one point I would really like to highlight here as well.
Okay, that was actually a very interesting point. Thank you so much. That was Asad Baig speaking with us with reference to what's happening in occupied and annexed Kashmir as far as the suspension of internet services is concerned. Let me hop over to Hassan Akbar here. Hassan, one, of course, this whole business of not having internet services, which essentially means that modern and daily life grinds to a halt. But then I also want to discuss with you this particular video that went viral, which was essentially the consul general, a diplomat, an Indian diplomat, talking about the Israeli settlement model. Now, and he's also said very clearly that this government, as in this RSS BJP government, is determined to do exactly that. Now, if this comes to pass, what response do we have to this?
I think we'll have to take this very seriously. Ejaz, initially there were a lot of concerns that were raised when Article 370 and the abrogation of the article and Article 35 was being discussed in the media amongst Kashmiris. This is before August 5th. And the primary concern that a lot of even political activists inside occupied Kashmir and people within Pakistan was that this was an attempt to orchestrate a demographic change, and you bring that demographic change about by adopting a policy like the Israeli policy in the West Bank, which is settlements and a population change, a demographic change. The reality is that 4 months into the August 5th decision, many of those fears are coming true. Let's look at the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act, which was brought into force on the 31st of October. Subsequently, what's happened, two things are happening, which a lot of people are not talking about, Ejaz. The first is that there's a renaming spree happening. As you know, that BJP has renamed many of the Muslim-sounding names of cities and other places in the rest of India, such as Allahabad has been changed to Pragyaraj. Similarly, the BJP is now undertaking, through the J&K Reorganization Act, a renaming spree. So, for example, one of the most famous landmarks in Srinagar is the Sher-e-Kashmir Stadium, named after Sheikh Abdullah. Now it's going to be changed and named as the Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel Stadium. Similarly, they're going to replace Urdu boards and Urdu names with Hindi and in the Devanagari script. This is just the start of a long drawn process in the minds of the BJP government and Indian politicians to change the status, the Muslim majority nature, the culture of Kashmir, especially the Kashmir Valley. Similarly, another thing that they have done is that on the 22nd of October, a new bill was introduced in J&K, a new act was introduced, whereby a new revenue department has been created for the sale, purchase and transfer of property in Kashmir. Now, as you know, the earlier Jammu and Kashmir Registration Act forbade non-state subjects, so those that were not residents of Indian occupied Kashmir, to buy or purchase or property in Kashmir, so that they could not gain resident status or voting rights in Kashmir. Now, through this revenue department, what they've done is that they've removed the bar on the sale purchase of property for non-Kashmiris. So non-Kashmiris will be able to buy property. And most significantly, we're now hearing that the government itself is undertaking a large-scale purchase of land in Kashmir through its departments. And the idea there being that they want to bring in not only Kashmiri Pandits back into Kashmir, but also non-residents, non-Kashmiris in large numbers to ensure that a demographic change takes place. Now, while all of this is happening, it's very closely linked with the crackdown on the internet, Ejaz, because what's happening is that they've closed down the internet for two things. The first is to ensure that there is no coordination for protests. And people are not able to share or vent their frustration through social media, WhatsApp groups, etc., or Twitter. And the second very important aspect of the lockdown in the internet is to ensure that images of protests or images of the kind of violence that's being meted out to young boys and men in Kashmir is not shown on Twitter, Facebook, and the international media. So it's both a clampdown on information as well as a clampdown on their right to mobilization and the right to gather. What we've heard, very disturbing news from several international outlets recently, including a piece in the New Yorker, which you must have read, about the kind of brutality that is being meted out to young boys and young men in Kashmir, which includes beating them up, using electrocution, using sodomy, against young boys who are accused of, throwing throwing stones at security forces in South Kashmir. And this kind of aggravated assault that's happening is certainly a very serious concern for Pakistan, for Kashmiris, and should be a very serious concern for international human rights organizations, Ejaz. Lastly, I'd also like to point out that another very serious thing that's happening in Indian-occupied Kashmir is that increasingly we're seeing reports that the Indian intelligence agencies and Indian police officials and administration officials are trying to create a third political front. What they're doing now is that they're asking the former MLAs from pro-India, erstwhile pro-India parties such as PDP, National Conference and Congress, that they would be released if they agree to join a new political front. And I fear this is the same new political front which was launched on the 6th of September, a month after the release, after the abrogation of Article 370 by a group of 5 unknown Kashmiris who claimed that they had formed a new political party in Kashmir. So at the same time, while there's violence, while there's oppression going on in Kashmir, there's a real significant move to orchestrate a new political pro-India front in Kashmir to support the abrogation of Article 370, which is entirely against the wishes and the will of the Kashmiri people. And thirdly, there is a concerted effort to undertake demographic change to the Muslim majority nature of Kashmir.
Thank you for a brief exposition there, Hassan. It seems to me, going by what you're saying and going by what we are witnessing in occupied Kashmir, that Indian strategy is wedded to the idea that they can hold off pressure for another 6 months to a year. And in that period, they are going to take steps which will, essentially enchain the Kashmiris further. And then they will, this is going to be the package, the fait accompli. I mean, there was a fait accompli on 5th August, and then so on and so forth. So these are steps, various steps, to the kind of settlement process that we were talking about, which essentially means, if this thesis is correct, and if you agree with it, then the challenge for us is obviously growing, both in terms of scope as well as in terms of difficulty.
I would agree 100% with you, Ejaz. The Indian belief is, and the BJP government's belief is that they would be able to undertake and orchestrate the kind of change that they envision in Indian-occupied Kashmir in a year or 2 years, and that they will be able to crush any resistance from Kashmiris. And one element of that is, opening up old cases against the Hurriyat leadership, such as the case against Yasin Malik, the terror funding case against Alisha Gilani, and a new case about protests. 21 years ago in Srinagar, there were protests. They've opened up that case as well. So on the Hurriyat front, they're putting a lot of pressure. They're using the carrot policy with PDP and National Conference leaders, and they believe this. Now, the challenge for Pakistan is that how seriously do we recognize the difficulty that Kashmiris are facing in the resistance, number one. Number two, how intrinsic is the Kashmir issue for the idea of Pakistan? Number three, how critical do we believe the challenge to our security in the north will be if India is able to fulfill its plans vis-a-vis Kashmir. So in the long run, if India is able to present this as a fait accompli, not just to Kashmiris, but also to Pakistan and the international community, what will be the repercussion in terms of our diplomatic, our diplomatic position vis-a-vis India in dialogue, etc. And India's not letting go of their claim on AJK and GB. Let's remember that. So this presents a very unique problem for Pakistan. Now, for Pakistan, it's important not just to raise this issue diplomatically at the United Nations and at the international fora, but I think that if India does not step back from the kind of steps that it is taking continuously within Kashmir and on the line of control, the heavy escalation that we've seen, there is a challenge that Pakistan will inevitably have to answer for itself, which is, do we take certain non-diplomatic measures to ensure our own security and our own, interests, not just along the line of control, but also vis-a-vis the people in Kashmir who we consider to be Pakistanis. So this is an important question that Pakistan's government needs to introspect about, the people of Pakistan need to introspect about, because losing focus on the issue in Kashmir will inevitably result in a fait accompli. So for Pakistan, it's very important that creating diplomatic pressure also requires Pakistan to take certain very proactive steps about what's happening in Kashmir and vis-a-vis India to highlight the kind of not only the atrocities that are happening and the human rights abuses that are happening in Kashmir, but the seriousness of the disputed nature of Kashmir and its importance for Pakistan as a state. So I think increasingly in the coming months, Pakistan will have to take some hard decisions about our policy on Kashmir and how far we are ready to go to protect our interests in that disputed region.
Absolutely, and it seems to me clearly that, I'm happy you talked about the maps that they issued which show Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan as part of India. And I think for a long time, India had been pushing out the story that it was a status quo power and Pakistan was the reactive state and all that. Now, India's irredentism is right there. It's not a narrative being put out by Pakistan. It's something that India has put out through its own cartographic aggression, so to speak. And quickly, since I have to wrap up this segment also, Hassan, I think that is also an issue. I mean, if we have to at some point resort to reacting through kinetic means, at least we need to prepare the grounds for that and tell the world that the aggressor here is India, and it's embarked on a step-by-step policy of aggressing against not just the Kashmiris but also against Pakistan.
Agreed. That's very right. I think it's very important for us in Pakistan to set the ground and to create the kind of noise internationally that is required on this. It's very important to focus on the humanitarian aspect of what's happening in Kashmir, Ejaz, but I think sometimes we lose focus on the disputed nature of the problem in Kashmir. Let's not forget that this is a disputed territory. We claim it to be a part of Pakistan. And while we want to focus the attention of the international community on the humanitarian aspect of the abuses being committed by Indian forces in Indian-occupied Kashmir, let's not forget that this is a disputed territory. The people in Kashmir want to be a part of Pakistan. They want their right to self-determination. to be exercised. So both the land is disputed, the people do not accept Indian occupation and Indian aggression, and therefore Pakistan has, as I've said earlier also, both the moral and legal obligation to take the Kashmir cause up in every which way that Pakistan can.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Hassan Akbar speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the growing unrest in Iran. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. When the Iranian government announced it was raising the price of fuel by up to 3 times, it triggered what may have been the largest scale unrest in the 40-year history of the Islamic Republic. Iranian officials this week estimated 200,000 people were involved in protests and riots that led to 7,000 arrests, and by some estimates, the regime's deadliest ever response to demonstrations. The government has also shut down the internet. U.S. Special Envoy for Iran, Brian Hook, has said that the Iranian security forces may have killed more than 1,000 people since protests began mid-November. However, he cautioned that the numbers are not definitive because Tehran is blocking all information. Amnesty International said on Monday that it had documented the deaths of at least 208 protesters, making the disturbances the bloodiest since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. What is going on in Iran? To answer that question, we have with us Mr. Farshid Ariyan. He's an Iranian human rights activist based in London. Mr. Ariyan, thank you for being on the program. Give us a sense of what exactly is happening and what exactly are the numbers, if at all one can put any number on, in terms of killings and, injuries and the rest of it.
The unrest is actually the last unrest in Iran. As you can see, this one is in the huge scale. And why? Because then you can see that every 10 years, since after only 2 years after the revolution, we have the first unrest, which resulted mass killing up to the whole 10 years. And then we had again in another movement in 10 years after, and then again we had another movement 10 years after, and then again 10 years after, and twice before that. The issue is completely clear. After the revolution, everybody thought that everything would be changed into a better position. Unfortunately, all those empty promises not only was not delivered by the regime of Iran at whole. We're not talking about any fraction, but instead, every day, the day-to-day life of the people and their freedom of speech and their general freedom overall was they were in breach of their freedom and human rights. As a human rights activist who have been involved in years in the issues of Iran, especially I've been involved in Iran tribunal trials, which we took Iranian, the whole state to the court, People's Court, and they were actually somehow named as have committed crime against humanity. And that was the mass killings of during the 80s. And now you can see that today we have another mass killings. And that is only the beginning. You asked me about the numbers. Unfortunately, I've been involved and in connection with Harana, human rights organization, which is dealing with the news in Iran, and human rights news, and also Amnesty International and the rest international community. And the minimum numbers that, as you mentioned, sir, yourself, is 1,000 people killed and couple of more than 6,000 people injured, and more than 15,000 people or 13,000 people arrested. As you mentioned yourself, nobody knows how many. because even those people who have been killed, in giving their families their body, they keep telling the families that you shouldn't mention that they have been killed. And this is the issue. In Iran, you can't see numbers. In that has been always the way that we could say authoritarian state has actually acted to hide everything, and then from one way they want to create fear, and from the other way they just don't want to reveal the numbers.
Okay,
And
Mr. Ariyan,
really,
there's another
really
thing. There's another thing. So, on Wednesday, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani essentially said that any unarmed and innocent people that have been detained over the last 2-3 weeks should be released. The government is also saying that this unrest is essentially fueled by the United States, by Israel, and they also name, of course, Riyadh for this. Are any external actors actually exploiting the situation, or is this situation entirely a domestic issue?
I am really amazed. This is the way that this state has always acted. If anything happens, they say that foreigners have been behind it. This is a conspiracy theory that because we want to be free and the whole Western world and the whole world are against us, so therefore any act of demonstration or protest is fueled or has been planned by foreigners. And this is obviously, before you called me just a couple of minutes ago, I was watching an interview with the mother of one of the young people who were killed. And this person, which has been a very good-looking man, called Puya, with the father of that person. Also another one with the mother. Another one has been a poet, writing things and working hardly. The other one working as a pharmacist and was a bodybuilder as well. And there are many of them. Look at their faces. They first of all, they were not. They didn't have any weapon at all. The only weapon they had, maybe sometimes when they started and they were attacked, maybe they used to burn things down. And that was especially because of the tear gas, which was shot into the center of the demonstrations. They are all fourth generation of Iranian young people protesting and claiming that we do not want this administration. They are not providing people of Iran with the welfare and their rights, and they want their citizen right back. They have heard enough.
Interesting. Marianne, stay with me. I'm also joined by Mr. Akeel Abbas, who's a professor, is from Iraq, currently based in North Virginia. Mr. Abbas, thank you for being on the program. I was just discussing with Mr. Ariyan the unrest that's going on in Iran. I believe you talked about the unrest in Iraq earlier on one of my programs. What I want to know is that while the Iraqis, especially in southern Iraq, are agitating for various reasons, but also getting extremely unhappy with Iran, Iran is also having its own unrest. What exactly is going on right now? Since we last spoke, has there been any attempt at a dialogue, or getting some kind of agreement or modus vivendi, or the situation is still getting worse?
I mean, I would not argue that the situation is getting worse. The situation is getting probably more tense as we get to the deciding moment. What happened, I think the major development happened yesterday. There was always an argument by the anti-protest forces, and this argument is that there are saboteurs among the protesters. This is a claim by the pro-Iran forces in Iraq and those who are against the protests. So yesterday, they brought a big demonstration between 5,000 to 7,000 people, brought them to the Tahrir Square to be in the same place with the protesters. And the scenario that was widely circulated over the past 2 days is that these groups, these new or pro-Iran demonstrators who came in, their main purpose was to stir violence, to basically cause some sort of a clash with the other protesters in the same square, to give reason for the security forces to come and clear everybody else, and hence control the Tahrir Square, the nerve center of the protests in Iraq. That was the scenario. But obviously, it seems like the protesters, the original or true protesters, have showed a great deal of discipline. They were aware of that scenario, and somehow they avoided really clashes. They avoided widespread violence. Around 31 people were stabbed from the protesters. The day after, it's a Friday today, Grand Ayatollah Sistani basically came more or less in support of the protesters, saying that the other protesters, the pro-Iran protesters, should not use my photo, because they basically came and their slogans were in support of Sistani, raising his picture. It was an act of political mobilization to embarrass the other side, so on and so forth. So that's the development. The major development is that these attempts to torpedo the protests, to turn them into acts of violence and sabotage, basically failed. And plus, Sistani insisted, and this is another important development, that the formation of the new Iraqi government should happen within the Iraqi deadlines and with no intervention from outside forces. The reference is obviously to Iran and the United States. So more emphasis on Iraq's sovereignty. Other than this, I think the protests are there for the long haul. The government is still in a difficult situation. The whole political class cannot come up with a response that satisfies the protests.
Absolutely. That's very interesting. One final question, Mr. Abbas. Is it more than symbolic, the intervention by Sistani, or do you think he has enough spiritual as well as political clout to make the government, the ruling class, think seriously about reforms and talking to the genuine protesters?
No, it's not symbolic. Actually, his interventions over the past really 4 weeks, let's say 8 weeks more or less, have been crucial. Basically, the situation in Iraq is that the political class, the government, has lost its social base, has no support basically within the population. The only semblance of support comes through the marja'iyya, the clerical establishment, and it is not support for the political class per se or the government per se, but it's support for the institutions. So basically, Sistani supports institutions, and the interpretation of this, that this is support for the government because the government runs the institutions, more or less. But even in his support of institutions, he's actually asking for reforming these institutions by more or less supporting the demands by the protesters. I think increasingly Sistani's position is moving towards the protesters. The only thing that he has not acknowledged or came out in support of is that this political class, this government is incapable of making serious, genuine reform. The protesters themselves do not trust the government, do not trust that it can make any meaningful, significant reforms.
Absolutely. That was something we discussed last time also, and I think that's one of the sticking points anyway. But thank you so much. That was Mr. Abbas speaking with us. Let me go back to Mr. Ariyan. Mr. Ariyan, I find this really ironic that while the Iranian regime says that the unrest in Iran is being caused by external forces, the fact is that the Iraqis are saying that Iran is interfering in Iraq, and they are protesting against that. So it's a deeply ironic situation. It seems to me that Iran itself is also projecting power in the greater Middle East while saying that its enemies are trying to create unrest within Iran. How do you look at that?
A very interesting point. It's very clever of you to, I mean, really, they are themselves, as we could say, they are themselves the country and the state which is putting their nose everywhere in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in whatever country that you can name it. And of course, they're not actually taking responsibility for the unrest in those countries. And the people of Lebanon, the people of Iraq came out to the street and protesting, leave us alone. And this is also the people of Iran who are asking them to leave us alone. Just, we don't want you anymore here. And this is exactly, and why is it that if they are talking about those foreign forces, why are they trying to get connected and have deals with them? They want to have every deal in their term and for their interest. And actually, the whole world have had enough of them. And the people of Iran and the people of Lebanon and the people of Iraq and all those suffering is caused by the Iranian government.
Well, some would suggest, there is a power play going on. There are other actors also, but stay with me, Mr. Ariyan. I'm also joined by Dr. George Szamuely, joins me from Budapest. He's a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Dr. Szamuely, thank you for being on the program. We're talking about the unrest in Iran. We realize that lots of figures are circulating. No one really knows. Nothing definitive can be said because information is not easy to come by because of the suspension of internet services and the rest of it. But A, give me a sense of what you think is happening in Iran. And secondly, there's also the fact that the Iraqis, for instance, the northwest, in southern Iraq, they're protesting and saying that Iran is interfering and our ruling class is beholden to Iran. So it's a strange kind of scenario that is developing in the region. What's your take on this?
Well, it's very hard to know exactly what is going on in Iran. There's no question that the disturbances, the protests are in some way a response to the hardships that have been imposed on Iran through the sanctions policy that the United States has imposed, because that is a very big deal. I mean, Iran had made the sacrifice that it would basically put in abeyance its nuclear program in return for the lifting of sanctions. And now the sanctions have returned. The United States has applied it in a very aggressive way, hitting third countries, and so this has caused hardship. So I think that has played a major role, and as it was intended to do, because that's always been the U.S. goal: regime change in Tehran. And one way of doing that is through inciting protests, anti-government protests.
So when the Iranian government says that there are external actors involved in this, they're essentially referring to the sanctions and the consequences of those sanctions, or is there more to that allegation?
Well, the sanctions is certainly an important element to it. But there's also, without question, I mean, the United States has been actively involved in sponsoring protests in Iran through the MEK movement, which is sponsored by the US, through nationalist separatist movement in Iran, in Baluchistan, and so on, so which the United States has been behind. So yes, there's no question that the US has been actively involved for decades in trying to stir unrest in Iran. But I think the immediate cause of this has been the reimposition of sanctions in a particularly aggressive form in which Iran is unable to sell its oil and therefore unable to earn any revenue. I mean,
okay, I take your point, but here's another thing. It seems to me that when the government jacked up the fuel prices by 300%, the common Iranian thought to himself, well, here's the thing. You are, still going for your missile program. You're spending a lot of money on that. Apparently, you're also rolling back from the JCPOA because you said that the Americans walked away from it, and therefore we will step by step go back to where we started. So the common Iranian seems to say, well, you actually putting a lot of pressure on me, while instead of essentially cost cutting elsewhere in terms of your sort of power outreach in the greater Middle East and spending money on various militias in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and the rest of it. Do you think that makes sense? That argument makes sense? I mean, this is hypothetical, but I seem to believe that if I were one of the Iranians, I probably would have thought like that.
You might raise a good point, and I also can see some merit in the argument. Of course, the Iranian leaders would then turn around and say that these things, such as our missile program, our involvement in Iraq and in Syria, are necessary for our national security because we are under threat from Israel and the United States. Both countries have repeatedly issued threats against Iran, including military threats. And there's a real issue that Iran might find itself encircled with Iraq on one side, Afghanistan on another side. And so you can see why the leaders might say, yeah, we're spending money on our security, but we need it. I mean, this is because we are under threat. And we're threatened by.
So it becomes a catch-22 of sorts. I take that point. Thank you. That was Dr. George Szamuely speaking with us. Before I wrap up, and I just have a couple of minutes, going back to Mr. Ariyan. So Ariyan, Dr. Szamuely was saying that there is merit in the argument that there are external actors involved in exploiting and deepening fault lines in Iran.
I do not agree with Mr. George, unfortunately, because we have had so many unrest. And I mean, he mentioned about sanctions, but sanctions is the direct result of the behavior of Iranian country. Iranian authorities. And we can see also as well that they have been actually involved in all countries. As he mentioned, of course, Iranian government can claim anything. But if that argument is actually acceptable and rational or accepted by international community, I mean, the way that they have treated their people overall has been unbelievable. The way that they have killed. We haven't had the same regime in the whole history of Iran.
Okay.
The way that they have actually breached the human rights.
Thank you, Mr. Ariyan. This is all the time that I had for this segment, and this is all for this week also from Indus Special. We shall see you next Thursday at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.